This is a Step Beyond the Fire podcast. My name is Cully. I'm a land manager and a wildlife biologist here in my home state of Florida. I invite you to join me on a journey as I seek to document the little-known stories told by those who use fire for the benefit of the land, also known as prescribed fire. So come on, let's head into the field and meet the people where the flame ends and new life begins. Welcome back, listeners. I'm excited to be here today. We appreciate you joining us on a Step Beyond the Fire podcast. I've had a little bit of an opportunity to take a break, kind of reconnect a little bit, and figure out my priorities in life. And I appreciate all of you sticking with me. And I also want to mention that I'm thankful. I'm really thankful for the many opportunities, the good stories that have come about, the learning experiences, and I'm also thankful for my good friend Steve Miller, who's helped out and guest hosting this. And as we get into season 3 now, I've got a little bit of a different shade of these meetings planned for you, so we can educate and engage and fire and learn about how, through people's experiences, how fire is impacting their world and fire is impacting our natural world at the same time. So I'd like to welcome a gentleman named Jon Trapp to our show. Jon is an Air Force veteran turned wolf biologist, having been involved with carnivore research in the Southwest and Northern Rockies. Jon has transitioned since his time as a biologist into the wildland fire scene in the small town of Red Lodge, Montana, which I'm excited to talk about that town because I think I've driven through there, but I might be wrong about that. But in Red Lodge, he's an assistant fire chief. He's a fire behavior analyst, and he's also in search and rescue. Welcome to the show, Jon. I appreciate you getting together with us.
Yep, glad to be here.
I'm also excited because you're the first person who's reached out to me who listened to the podcast, in past episodes and express some interest in sharing your experiences and stories for all the other folks that are listening to the show. So that's good. I'm really excited about that. So I want to first start by asking about Red Lodge. Now, Red Lodge is not one of those towns that now correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not one of those towns that you just sort of drive and it's a pass-through town, and it's kind of along the wayside. It takes a lot to get there from what I could see on the map. So tell us about Red Lodge and some of the work that you're doing there right now.
Yeah, so Red Lodge is at the end of the Rocky Mountains on the east side. So as you're coming in from maybe Minnesota or North Dakota, South Dakota, when you first come to the Rocky Mountains, you're hitting the edge, and that's where Red Lodge is. So Red Lodge is also just northeast of Yellowstone National Park. There's a pass. It's called the Beartooth Pass, a very high alpine pass that goes up and over and drops right into Red Lodge. So it is, a good portion of the year, Red Lodge is at the end of the road because the Beartooth Pass has very deep snow preventing any movement across the pass. So a lot of the year you do have to go out of your way to get to Red Lodge, but we're surrounded to the north of us, grass and sagebrush, and to the east, and then to the south and west of us, giant mountains. The tallest peak in Montana is within view of Red Lodge, Granite Peak, and ponderosa pine, but primarily lodgepole pine forests, Douglas fir forests, and all that kind of nestle up. And Red Lodge sits right at the base of those mountains. So I first came to Red Lodge in 2004 as a newly hired Fish, Wildlife, and Parks wolf biologist. And so I came to Red Lodge to help manage the wolf population in Montana in one of the first full-time positions that the state had to offer. And I had come by way of Wyoming, working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Idaho, working for the Nez Perce tribe. And before that, I was in Arizona and New Mexico, working with the Mexican Gray Wolf program. And they all kind of eventually landed me here in Red Lodge, Montana, where I worked with the wolf management program for about 3 years or so, and had a significant life change, that is becoming a dad, and had to make some different decisions on how much time.
I'm right there with you, brother. I'm excited too.
Yeah, I had to make some different decisions on how much time I was.
We'll talk about that too.
Yeah. There was a lot of time in the wilderness, in the backcountry, no cell phone service, running off of sat phones, and that was not super conducive to being a dad. So.
Oh yeah, I can imagine.
Although I loved being in the backcountry and hanging out with wolves, I loved hanging out with my daughters more, and so I made some decisions. And there was some. I already had my EMT. I was already working on search and rescue as a volunteer, and they encouraged me to apply for a firefighter paramedic position in Montana. So, or in Red Lodge.
Far out.
Yeah, and they agreed to send me to all the fire academies and paramedic schools, and so that I could do that job. And even though I wasn't ready to give up working with wolves completely, at least I was transitioning to a job where I was home most every night, except when I learned more about wildland firefighting, and that kind of changed it a little bit more. Yep.
Yep, that does change the scene a little bit. You're a wise man for finding a way to be home and available, because that's that's a big part of being a dad for sure. And it sounds like you found a good transition point there to get into, and I'm sure there's a big need for it in your part of the country as well too.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's like we make a lot of choices in where we go and what we do, and I had the opportunity to be able to do both, and I did choose my family first, but then I was able to kind of move into a different career field, wildland firefighting and search and rescue, and so it was a good move. And then I continued to work in Yellowstone with wolves and teaching about wolf management and ecology in Yellowstone National Park, and I still continue to do that because I think it is a important thing for people to understand what's really going on with wolf management.
Which leads well into my next question I had for you, and it's a little bit about the modern day wolf controversy that has been going on for the last decade or two. And you've obviously got a diverse background in large carnivore research and conservation. So for those of us who are a little bit unfamiliar with that, can you talk about some of that, some of your interactions with folks in the midst of that controversy, especially as it pertains to like Yellowstone area where you're at?
Yeah, wolf reintroduction was very controversial. So if you think about how the West was settled, on a big scale, it was settled by timber, by mining, and by ranching, the railroads, all these things were very important when America was a new nation and trying to establish that footprint of the new nation. And to do that, ranching was one of the things that could take place on the landscape. And right off the bat, early in the settlement of the West, the ranchers were trying to make a go of it, and they were saying, "Hey, we're getting hit by predators out here, and we need some help." And if you look at, even before that, in Europe, they had similar situations where there were carnivores on the landscape, and they had to adapt how they ranched, and often that involved being camping out with the sheep or their livestock to prevent wolves from killing them. But so early on, we were, as a nation, we're trying to do everything that we could to support ranching, because it was help putting a footprint on the landscape that we were trying to settle as a nation, and ranchers were a big part of that. So fairly quickly, early on, there was in the U.S. government, there was an organization, it's called Predatory Animal and Rodent Control, and it was under the Department of Agriculture and Department of Interior, but it was designed to kill the things that were killing the livestock. And early on, there was this concern about wolves, and wolves were killing some livestock, but so were grizzly bears, so were mountain lions, and so was lightning, and and so was a lot of things. So there was a lot of things out on the landscape, especially in the
fire too,
and fire, in the American West, that really, they kill livestock, or they got a hard life. And so this organization had a concerted effort to remove wolves from the landscape. And they did a really good job, because wolves are pack animals and they're pretty easy to find. And by the early 1900s, the wolves were pretty much wiped out across most of the United States. And which is interesting, because most of the lower 48 states had wolves on it when European settlement took place. And so you think about that. And then we decided as a nation, and the Endangered Species Act said, "Oh, we want wolves back on the landscape." And a lot of the ranchers are like, "Wait a minute, we don't want wolves," right?
That's when things got a little dicey.
Yeah, they're like, "We don't want wolves. We got rid of the wolves. Why would we want them back?" And so it was very contentious, and in the process, because there were a lot of people, and our public lands, we have to remember, our Forest Service, National Park lands, even BLM lands, all these public lands are for the public as a whole, not just for ranching, or not just for mining. And so a lot of people in the United States said, we want wolves back. Now, of course, most of those people didn't have to deal with wolves directly.
There were probably a lot of people from like urban areas and weren't dealing with wolves back in the day, or have family members who were dealing with them in past generations, right?
Right. And so they didn't have to deal with it directly. The ranchers did. And so then the wolves were reintroduced back into the Northern Rockies in 1995 and 1996. And it's interesting, because wolves were one of the first species listed on the Endangered Species Act in 1973. So the Endangered Species Act had been around for a long time. Wolves were listed, but it took over 20 years before they actually were put back on the ground in the Northern Rockies, because it was very contentious, and there was a lot of concerns. So that continues to be the case, but I think that, I mean, statistically, and the data shows that a majority of ranchers will never have an issue with the wolf. But some ranchers will have continued issues with the wolf, because of the way the landscape funnels wolf activity, just like the landscape can funnel fire activity, right? So there's some that are taking the brunt of it more so than others, and I do have empathy for that, and there are some solutions that we can try to strive for to help those ranches. So that's the main contentious issue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's that leads pretty well into some of the modern techniques that we use as biologists to manage the landscapes in sort of the modern world now. And there's a lot of different techniques and ways that things that we can employ to help with ecology. Because the thing about ecology, I was thinking about this earlier this week. If you look at ecology, the word ecology in the basic sense is the study of the interaction between organisms in their environment, right? So once you start taking bits and pieces of those organisms out of their environments and moving things around, then you're left with unbalanced dynamics in the ecosystems. So the ungulate populations change, and it changes and as a direct result, it changes the vegetative structure of the landscape. And then next thing you know, the ecosystems shift into different dynamics that could even be worse for wildfire dynamics too, and so on and so forth. And I want to point out, so speaking of like different techniques and technology that's being used nowadays, I saw an article in the Wildlife Professional magazine that talked about how the USDA is even now using things like drones as a non-lethal hazing tool for protecting livestock from gray wolves. And that's over in Oregon. And they're actually there, and I quote in this article, it says, in 2022, this innovative hazing tool decreased livestock depredations from approximately one depredation every other night to approximately one every 6 weeks. So not only have we employed other techniques in the past to help manage populations like gray wolves, now the technology is becoming such that we're able to use it more effectively in targeted situations that can really help balance things out a little bit better. And I think it's a fascinating science, and I'm sure you're seeing quite a bit of that type of cutting edge research going on in your part of the world too.
Yeah, it's interesting as we learn, and that is a good use. I've found one of the most effective tools in reducing conflict between wolves and livestock, which is the main issue, is a program called Range Riders. And what it really is just going back to the beginning, where you have someone on horseback who is actually on the landscape with the livestock. And that has incredible success. It's very simple. It's a horse, it's a person, but it's time and it's money, of course. And that's how I started in the wolf management. I was essentially a range rider. I did it in a variety of ways, but I remember, I slept in the back of the truck in Grand Teton National Park. And Grand Teton's interesting because it has some livestock holdings in it. Most national parks do not. And there was a wolf pack called the Teton Pack, and they had a den, and they had to move through a livestock pasture to get to the other side where the elk were to kill elk, right? And so, of course, that looks like a recipe for disaster, right? It's like, all right, so there's a den, there's a bunch of livestock, and there's elk on the other side. And these wolves, so my job was actually to stay overnight in the pasture. And of course, there was other things like moose, grizzly bears. There was a lot of stuff out there. And I'm sleeping in the back of my truck out in this pasture. And I would just lay there, and once in a while I would wake up or I'd set my alarm. But mostly I just listened. And one night I woke up and I heard all the cattle just going. They were all bawling and they were very upset. And so I got out of the truck, and I had a shotgun, and it was loaded with it had rubber bullets and cracker shells. So the rubber bullets were intended to hit the target animal, and the cracker shells are basically like shooting an M80 firework through the air at whatever it is you're shooting it at. It kind of arcs through the air, and then it explodes. And I walked down the tree line, or the fence line. I had my flashlight, I had my shotgun. I didn't know what it was. It could have been a grizzly bear. It could have been anything, but I heard this cow like just bawling. They were very upset. And as I got closer, I could see that it was a wolf. It was hold on, my dog's barking. It was speaking of a wolf, right?
Oh, there's a wolf. I just heard one in the background.
Yeah, domestic wolf. And so as I rounded the corner, it was a yearling wolf, and it was testing a cow, trying to get the cow to run, because that's what wolves do. They want their prey to run. A majority of the time, if the prey does not run, the wolves do not engage. Hold on one second. Let me get the door here. All right, there we go. All right, less squeaky toy sounds now. So I walked down the line, and I could see this wolf trying to get the cow to run, but the cow wasn't running. And so I got closer and closer, and I was able to, it didn't notice I was coming, and I was able to line up a shot and fire a rubber bullet at it. And I hit its hindquarters. And these really sting and leave a mark. And but you're just like any dog, right? You want to catch them in the act, and you want to try to.
It makes sense,
right? You, like, if your dog goes to the bathroom on the rug, right? You don't, punish them later. You really want to catch them doing it. So, and wolves,
except for rolled up newspaper, doesn't work so well on a wolf.
Right. it might, but you have to be pretty brave, I think, to use it.
Right.
So I was able, it was in the act of doing what we didn't want it to do, trying to get this cow to run. And I was able to hit it directly in the act, and it took off running.
So this is at night. You're there with a flashlight, and you're just line it up and hit him in the hindquarters.
Yeah. And then the next one in the chamber was a cracker shell. So you aim that into the air, and it flies over the air and then explodes right over the head. And when it does, it lights up like the 4th of July, and it sounds like World War III going off. It's a big explosion, and that wolf kept running. And then I switched back. I chambered another rubber bullet, and fired at it again, another cracker shell. And that's essentially what a range rider would do, range riders with the livestock. But in the West, what we do is we put our livestock out on allotments, because we haven't had a lot of predator risk. And then sometimes we leave them out for a month or 3 weeks. And then the ranchers will go and collect them up from that allotment and then move them to another allotment. But in the presence of carnivores, you can't do that anymore. You have to be with them, or you're going to have losses from wolves. But anyway, that one particular wolf kept, at that point forward, the rest of the wolf pack actually kept moving through the cattle to get to the elk, making a kill, coming back and feeding the pups at the den. But that one wolf would make a really wide berth. There was like a little mountain ridge, and it would go all the way around that ridge, and it wouldn't go nowhere near that pasture the rest of the time I was there. So I guess I
Wow,
left
that's
an
amazing.
impression.
So it worked.
Yep.
It worked. Yeah, I think that's really interesting to hear about that, because there's so many different, techniques and ways that you can address issues like that. And I think that's fascinating to hear that story, because, and it's sometimes the simplest approach is the best. And like that technology I mentioned earlier, sometimes, things like that can work well depending on where you are. And there's options, I guess, is kind of the modern day take on things. And I'm seeing different technologies used, but this, I was reading that thing because what it does is when they fly the drone, it has a speaker on it. So you actually yell at whatever is down there below. So I can just imagine who's ever running that controller is yelling curse words at the wolves, and they run away, kind of thing. So, we're in a different world these days, and I thought I'd share that with you because I just read that article, this magazine.
Yeah, that's great. We have a couple drones for the fire department. They have the optical, and they have the infrared sensors that you can use for fire detection stuff. But we're thinking about getting the speaker exactly for that, so you can fly over an area if someone's lost, and you're able to call down to them or speak to them.
Oh, yeah.
So it's used for search and rescue as well as running wolves off.
Wow. Yeah. Especially in that terrain out there. So let's shift a little bit towards fire. I think this is a good time because you had already talked about a little bit what prompted your change in career that you took. So you were studying wolves in the landscape on several different species, and you're seeing the effects of fire in these different types of landscapes. And what was the major aha moment for you when deciding to become a fire behavior analyst? And then maybe you talk a little bit about what that's like and what that job description is.
Sure. I mean, I think that when you're working on the landscape with something like wolves, and my graduate research actually focused on wolf den site selection in the Northern Rockies. There's the Northern Rockies are really big, but why are the wolves choosing these spots to den in when they have these huge areas like 300-400 square mile home ranges? Why that one spot? And so during my research, we were hiking a lot. We were going to dens. We were gathering information. On more than one occasion, there was a fire burning in the area. The whole place would be banked down with smoke. And I thought that, I was always intrigued by the role of fire on the landscape. So when I started, when I transitioned from working with wolves to working with wildfire, I started to see wow, there's these both of these things, wolves and wildfire, have an incredible role on the landscape in the ecological role that they fill. And there was this amazing poster that I found. I can send you an image of it, but it's from the 50s, and it's an image of a wolf. It's a Forest Service poster with an image of a wolf, and the wolf is made out of flames. And the message, of course, in the 50s for the Forest Service was like, don't unleash the beast.
Wolves are bad. Flames are bad.
Yeah, right. And it like really hit me
I
that,
see that. Yeah.
both from a management perspective, as you mentioned, wolves are bad, fire is bad. Like fire's taking out trees when we like trees for timber, and wolves are killing livestock. They're bad. Both of them are bad, so we need to exclude them from the landscape, which we did very effectively for a very long time, right? The wolves were off the landscape from basically the early 1900s until 1995, and fire had been excluded since the fires in 1910, where that was such a catastrophic fire season that that's when Bambi and Smokey the Bear, all that came out as like, we have to stop fire. And so
Yeah, and if folks are interested on the big blow up of 1910, if you're near a computer, Google that, and you can you can find out why our country embarked on a 60 or 70 years of fire suppression policy. It all started with that event, the big blow up of 1910, where millions of acres burned. And I forget what the numbers are, but they're staggering. So I just wanted to mention that to everybody.
Yeah, exactly. That is then the best book that I've come across about that was called The Big Burn. It's by Timothy Egan, and it's a really fascinating story about what brought us to that situation. It talks about Teddy Roosevelt, talks about the development of the National Forest Service, and how we got to essentially where we are today. It's a great book. It's great in audio format. The person that reads it's really good, but it really gets into that idea. And I found, working with fire after working with wolves, I just found, oh man, there's so many people that think that both of these things are bad, but both of them have this critical role to play on the landscape. And so I kind of view fire, if you think about low or moderate intensity fire moving across the landscape, it's selecting for maybe young or sick trees or dead trees. Like, it's cleaning up as it moves through the landscape when you have low or moderate intensity fire. And that's very similar to what wolves do, right? Wolves are, when they hunt, in general, they're selecting for sick, injured, weak, old, and they kind of are moving through the herd and selecting those out. So you think about, I was just like, my mind was like,
That's
wow,
a very unique parallel. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah, I was like, my mind was like blown. I was like, this is amazing. They're doing similar things, but differently, right? And when you look at, for instance, wolves, in the first 20 years that they were on the landscape in Yellowstone, the wolves' primary prey were elk, but they're within the elk, the average age of the elk that they were selecting was a 14-year-old cow elk. Now, elk can live longer than that, but at that age, they're not even reproductively active every year, and they're not a primary contributor to the health of the herd. And so you think about how wolves were removing what would have maybe allowed for reproduction in the herd, but mostly wasn't. And so,
Sure.
and then you compare that to human hunting. And so human hunting during the same time frame, the average age of an elk killed by a human hunter was 6. And so that means that human hunting, and I'm not anti-hunting, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, if you look at the selective pressure on the elk herd, humans were removing what would be a primary contributor to herd health, and wolves were removing what was kind of not. anymore. And
so they're removing the young dumb ones from the herd, but the wolves were actually filling their role in a much better way because they were removing the ones that were part of the older generation that ecologically was really the best candidate to remove from the herd.
exactly, and that concept is compensatory. It's called compensatory versus additive. So compensatory means that they're killing something that was going to probably die anyway. And often when we would cut into the femurs or whatever, these elk, they were not in good condition. They were not healthy, and there's a good chance they weren't going to make it through the winter, right? But additive would be killing an animal that would have lived, would have reproduced, and that is the selective pressure of human hunting. And at that same time in northern Yellowstone, not only do we have the normal hunting pressure, but they also added a late season hunt for many years, which was in January. And again, I mean, there was thousands of elk being removed by human hunting, which I support, but it's all in balance, right? You're removing these animals that would have been a key contributor to herd health. And then we watch the elk numbers drop in the northern range. And people that are anti-wolf were like, oh, well, that's because of the wolf. Even though the science shows...
There's your basic... I was going to say, there's your basic wildlife ecology 101 course. Who's to say we don't learn anything on this show?
Yeah. And
additive versus compensatory mortality.
There you go. And you think about the more I've done this, from wildlife management to fire management, the more I realize that we humans have we do really well at kind of screwing things up. And we want to understand what we're doing, and we want it to be often simple, but it's not. It's super complex. It's, for instance, like elk calf mortality, which is a huge part of the success. Well, the primary elk calf mortality is bears. It's not wolves, but people were focusing on wolves. Wolves and coyotes combined, a research study showed that wolves and coyotes combined only attributed to 10% of the elk calf mortality, but black bear and grizzly bears were approaching 60%. So we can try to blame, but the research really, I think, shows the truth. And but sometimes that research is complicated, and people want the easy answer.
Definitely. Well, that's really interesting to hear about that, because around the country we have similar stories of controversial, especially large carnivores being reintroduced to the landscape, like the Florida panther down here. And I even remember I was given a presentation one time about black bears, which are ecologically, omnivores, but taxonomically carnivores. So I guess they fit the mold a little bit. But this guy said, I get done, I spend like an hour giving this talk and all this presentation, and all these people were, the round of applause and all that stuff happened at the end. But then this guy raised his hand. He's like, well, so why do we need more black bears? And I was like, well, that's a really great question. And I kind of just took the opportunity to go into some of the things that you normally wouldn't think about with black bears, them being great seed dispersers, those kinds of things where, and them influencing different populations of white-tailed deer occasionally. And they eat carrion a lot. They really didn't, so there was some things there was a moment where I was like, man, how do I answer this question? Because it took me by surprise. I guess what I'm getting at is that people tend to look at things for their face value. Like, why the hell do I need this big carnivore in my backyard, whether it's a big cat, a wolf, that kind of thing, when it's important to take one step back and think about, well, yes, there's this danger element that's always going to kind of be there and kind of not be there, depending on, where you're at and what where you live and that kind of thing. But there's much more to it than just that. So I'm sure you've had a lot of that kind of stuff happen with folks when you're talking about wolves.
Yeah. When I started working with wolves, I really wanted to kind of promote wolves. I mean, I got into it because I believe that they deserved a place on the landscape. But the more I did it, the more I realized that it's really complex. The interactions between all the variables on the landscape, including fire, like there's this big kind of debate or voice that talks about how wolves return the balance to the ecosystem. But I think that there's a lot to that balance. For every one thing you're dropping on one side of the scale, there's two more things on the other side, and these things are very complex, the interactions. But there's areas in the park, in Yellowstone National Park, where we see, after the wolves came back, that the willow and the riparian cottonwood and the aspen started to regenerate in a way they hadn't in many years when the wolves weren't there. So a simple way to look at that would be like, well, the wolves weren't there, so the elk were over browsing, and therefore there was no willow regeneration, there was no cottonwood or aspen regeneration. Seems like a very easy, and I think that's, again, we look for these easy answers. And so these areas where there's huge regeneration that hadn't been seen in decades, basically since the wolves were extirpated from the landscape. And so you could draw that conclusion. But if you went down the valley a little bit further, in the Lamar Valley or in the Paradise, or Little America, which is a little further in the park, there would be the same slope, same aspect, same soil type, same number of wolves, same number of elk, same composition of vegetation, and it wasn't recovering. And the question is like, but some of the pro folks were like, oh, well, don't worry about that. Don't look over there, right? It's like, let's just look over here where it's doing great. But there's some things that go with it. And one of the big things is what you talk about on this podcast. The area that really rebounded was the area that had experienced fire. So you had this huge nutrient release from fire on the landscape. You had the wolves were back. The elk numbers were changed and their behavior was somewhat changed. And so now all of a sudden this area just explodes with new growth. But it's all these things that play at once. It's not just wolves. It's fire, it's black bears and grizzly bears, and it's pronghorn antelope, and it's mule deer, and and bison, and all these things are interacting in such a complex way. So that's what always blows my mind, is like, we want these simple answers, but it's just not. It's not simple. It's complex, but we know for our systems to function well, we need all the ingredients. It's kind of like when you make your stew at your house, right? And you got to add all those herbs and spices in there to get it to actually be really good when you're done, right?
Fire and wildlife, two of my favorite things to talk about. And that's really interesting. And You've obviously got a great passion for fire, and more specifically, prescribed fire too, as we talk about a lot on this show. And you've put some great articles out there too that were published through the International Association for Wildland Fire. So I'll try to post one of your articles that you sent over to me on the Facebook page when we get through with this. That way, folks can read a little bit more about some of your experiences. And I want to wrap things up today. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot of good stories and experiences. So if you had the listening ear of the whole world for 5 minutes, let's hear your elevator speech on why fire is important for us to understand.
Okay. And if we have like just a couple of minutes too, I didn't really answer that your last question completely because I kind of rambled on, but just for a minute.
Yeah, well, let's hear that too.
Just for a minute.
Yeah.
So any firefighter that's been on a large incident where it's like a type 1 incident management team, a type 2 incident management team, we're talking about hundreds or maybe thousands of firefighters. In the morning, you get your morning briefing, and you have, the operational brief, but you have also the weather briefing, and then you have the fire behavior briefing. And that's the part that I hadn't answered, Cully, was what does a fire behavior analyst do? So, as we know, like from our standard fire orders that we follow as firefighters, we have to base all of our actions on current and expected fire behavior. But how do we do that? How do we know what the current and expected fire behavior is going to be? Current, that one's pretty straightforward. We can look around us and watch the fire burning, right? But it's the expected part. And so the fire behavior analyst on a large incident is forecasting what the fire is going to do during the next operational period. And we do that, and I was drawn to this position. It required going up through a lot of the operational levels. You had to go through, engine boss or, crew leader up through task force leader, and then you had to be qualified as a division supervisor before you could even train as a fire behavior analyst. So it has a lot of operational background, which I really enjoy. Like, I enjoy that operational side. But at the end of the day, we have to say, this is what the fire is going to look like tomorrow or tonight. This is what the fire is going to do. And so we have to build our tactics at a broad scale. We might have 6 or 7 or 8 divisions out there. And the fire behavior analyst, will predict the fire behavior during that period, using fuels, weather, and topography. The same thing we learn as we first become a wildland firefighter. We learn about fuels, weather, and topography. And it's just as important and critical when you're all the way up at the level as a fire behavior analyst. We have to look at those things and then predict what the fire is going to be. And there's lots of models. There's fuel models, there's fire behavior models, and there's a lot of information. We use all of it. But the best part of the job for me is that I get to be on the fire line every day. I don't want to just sit at fire camp and punch out models. I predict the fire behavior, and then I'm out on the fire line observing it up close and seeing if I'm on target. So that, I hope, quickly answered.
Sounds like an incredible job.
Yeah, it's super fun. It's really fun. I enjoy the science part of it because you can, fire will behave the same way every time if the conditions are the same every time, right? And that's why, at the Missoula Fire Lab, they can produce the same array of fuels and wind and fuel moistures and RH and all these things, and it'll do the same thing over and over again. But of course, as we know, out on real wildfires, all those variables, especially fuel moisture and winds and relative humidity, are constantly in flux. So we have solar radiation, we have south-facing slopes and north-facing slopes. And so anyway, yeah, maybe we can talk more about all that stuff another time if you want to have me back on your show, Cully.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, I would love to. I would love to dive into that stuff a little bit more, because I want to get into some of the technical aspects of fire and provide maybe even a special series on that upcoming. So keep an ear out. I'd love to hear more on that.
Yeah. So then your second part, like regarding prescribed fire, as I mentioned earlier, we've excluded fire from the landscape for a long time, and we've done a really good job of controlling fire when it's low or moderate intensity, like early season fires and things like that, for such a long time that we now have an unnatural accumulation of wildland fuels. And we still can, in many cases, suppress early season fires because the fuel moistures are still high enough that we can jump on them and we can knock them out. But those low early season fires actually have an important ecological role in nutrient cycling and reducing the fuels on the landscape, both dead and dying and things like that, ladder fuels. So it has a super important role, and that, of course, is when most of prescribed fire happens, would be in the same time frame. So just as I can predict, really, I would say pretty accurately, fire behavior, we do the same thing for prescribed fire. We look at the fuels, we look at the weather, we look at the topography, and we're able to come up with a prescription saying, all right, if we're in this window and we have our holding resources, we have our fire suppression resources, we have our control features like lines around the fire, and we have our contingency plans, then yeah, let's light this thing off, right? Let's get a low, moderate intensity burn across an area to allow for fuel reduction and nutrient cycling. And a lot of species, especially in the West, and even obviously down in the Southwest, right? We have a lot of, or Southeast, we have a lot of fire-dependent species, as you know, Cully. And so fire needs to be on the landscape, but we have to do it in a very thoughtful way so that we can, improve forest health while simultaneously reducing risk of catastrophic fire. And we can totally do that. It's totally doable. So I guess that's my quick elevator pitch.
That's one of the best stump speeches I've heard in a long time. So that was great. Well, listen, it's been an awesome experience getting to connect with you, and I think we're going to definitely do this again at some point. And I'm sure folks would love to hear from you again too. Are there any good books or other podcasts or maybe trainings that you've come across recently that you want to share with folks?
Yeah, I think that I had mentioned The Big Burn by Timothy Egan. That is a really great book to kind of bring you up to speed to where we are and where our past is with fire in America. There's another good book that I was a contributor on. It's called Land on Fire. And so I think if you're fairly new to wildland firefighting or wildland fire ecology, Land on Fire, it's by Gary Ferguson, really has, it kind of boils down the big picture. It's written, it's got some interesting interviews and good stuff in there. From a wolf perspective, there's so much information, there's so much, I would say, misinformation out there about wolves. And so the best thing that we can do to really get the true story about wolves is to look to peer-reviewed research. But there are a few books out there. One of the new ones that's my favorite is a book called Yellowstone Wolves, and it consolidates a bunch of research over decades into more of a readable format, because a lot of research papers are pretty dry and boring. But it does take a lot of that research and put it together in a usable way. So those are probably my top books that I reference.
Well, thanks. That's super helpful, and folks, make sure that you check them out. Well, thank you, Jon, for your time and energy on this. It's been a real pleasure. And again, we look forward to maybe doing this again one day soon. And as always, we appreciate you taking us in another step beyond the fire.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.